Hello! We're returning to our usual weekly routine after the diversion for the first exam. We're also continuing with ideas that might seem pretty common sense, but that provide an opportunity to deepen our understanding, not unlike the topic of stress. The 4 questions for this unit are intended to help you with that process of deepening your understanding of things you might already know about, or understand at a more abstract level. For example, the idea of individual differences probably seems like common sense. It's a shorter way to refer to the things that make people different. Each of the characteristics we think about is probably pretty intuitive, too. It might be a surprise, though, when you realize how many of those characteristics there are. They range from things that are pretty stable, like personality, to things that can vary pretty substantially across the lifespan, like interests. You might be familiar with one of the types of cognitive ability from other classes. Intelligence might have come up in Gen Psych or other settings. While intelligence tends to get the most attention, there are actually a number of cognitive abilities. And we might not actually be talking about intelligence in the same way some psychologists do. Before you review the other resources in this module, you might think about what you think about when you think about intelligence. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but I think it makes sense. Then, as you learn about the definition and other cognitive abilities, you can compare and contrast your previous understanding with that information. The emphasis on health and wellness in various settings might have made the idea of different types of physical abilities as well known as the idea of intelligence. I have a feeling a large portion of the population have the idea that running, weightlifting, and yoga each do different things for the body. And that's the basic idea behind the 3 general factors at the top of the figure in this slide. When we think about it from the perspective of individual differences, though, we can get more specific, much more specific. Psychology tends to have something specific in mind, too, when we refer to personality, which may or may not be the same idea we have in more casual settings. In this context, we're talking about behavioral and emotional characteristics that lead to habitual ways of responding and that are stable across time. Situational norms might lead to some variations, but personality tends to predict behavior in a variety of circumstances. The situation versus personality debate has been intense, as has the discussion about how many distinct personality characteristics we can measure. The consensus tends to be that the Big 5 are accurate and sufficient for the majority of circumstances when we need to define personality. Hence the fact you might know about the Big 5 and might even have learned about the acronym OCEAN. Note that IO sometimes changes it up a bit, though, to use emotional stability instead of neuroticism. Individual difference characteristics also include the different types of knowledge an individual has, their skills, experiences, and other systematic variables that make individuals unique. We sometimes abbreviate that idea as KSAOs. As we think about those KSAOs, cognitive ability, physical ability, and personality, it's important to note that those individual differences are different from demographic variables. Demographic labels, like those for ethnicity or gender, are used to identify groups within the population, but there can be substantial variations within the group as well as between groups. In contrast, individual differences are measured person by person. There may be a correlation between demographic variables and some individual difference characteristics, but we still need to measure each individual on the characteristic because of the variation within groups. For example, if we think about the characteristics of firefighters, it can be tempting to think they need to be men because men are stronger. If we think about it in terms of individual differences, though, we would emphasize the specific physical abilities that firefighters need. We'll learn more about how that plays out in the hiring process in the next unit. Which brings us to the topic of assessment. Assessment is the term we use to describe the tests and measures that can be used to determine an individual's level of a particular individual difference characteristic. In IO, we use assessments to determine whether a person has the characteristics necessary for a job and help individuals improve in their job performance. Another way to think about assessment, then, is that it is a systematic way to gather information about an individual in order to classify them as having a certain level of the characteristic. Using reliable and valid measures of specific individual difference characteristics is important for a number of reasons, including reducing the potential for discrimination based on demographic variables. IO has a long and strong history of developing assessments and encouraging the use of valid assessments. It's interesting to realize that part of that history, a part that's influential to the discipline, was part of the war and other military efforts. The book explains more about that, but it's interesting to realize there seem to be two recurring themes that are as important now as they were in the past. One is the potential for the way the test is developed or administered to create bias. The second is fairness. Even if we establish the validity of an assessment and ensure it does not have bias, the scores used to classify individuals represent a value judgment and therefore have the potential to be unfair to particular groups. That's one reason, for example, that the use of physical abilities testing for firefighters has been the topic of great debate. One argument is that the decisions about the scores do not reflect what's actually necessary for the job, that they're more demanding than the job requires. That then can make it unfair to women because of differences in body composition. Taken together then, the potential for bias and for a lack of fairness means we have to be very deliberate when we administer an assessment in organizations. Your book provides more detail on how we can evaluate an assessment, including thinking about the source, administration, context, and the reference point for scores. We could probably make a good case for the argument that biographical data and interviews are the most common forms of assessments in organizations. Biographical data is the term we use for the information contained in applications or resumes. Looking at that information is based on what we call the ecological model, which is the theory that an individual's history represents choices and signals their abilities, interests, and personality. There's some degree of logic to that, but you can probably also think about a few weaknesses in that thinking. For example, being laid off is not typically a choice, but it could result in a gap in work history. Interviews are another common form of assessment. It's interesting to note, then, that they're not necessarily a valid way to assess individual differences. If the interview is structured and uses situational questions, it's more likely to be a valid assessment than an unstructured interview. Given that, it's interesting to realize how often applications and unstructured interviews are the only way potential employees are assessed. Another option is to use a test, sometimes referred to as a decision aid. In psychology, a test refers to an objective and standardized measure of a psychological construct. They can be used for a wide range of individual difference characteristics and administered in a number of ways. Your book talks about the different options, but one that might be particularly surprising is the performance test. It might be the one that's the most different from what we think of when we think of a test. So why do we care about assessment? The idea of person-job fit might have already come to mind. Indeed, being able to measure individual differences helps us determine how an individual will perform in a job. Individual differences can also relate to a range of behaviors that influence the work environment in general. Thinking about personality and person-job fit provides a good example of how psychologists can provide more specific information about common sense ideas, while also helping us think about a couple of the points about assessment. The specific information about common sense ideas comes in with the research findings about how the Big Five personality characteristics relate to performance at work. Research indicates that the 2 of the 5 relate to performance in general, while the other 3 only relate to specific situations. In addition, the combination of particular characteristics is related to success in different jobs. For example, emotional stability and conscientiousness are both important for jobs that require getting along with others, or being interested in getting ahead. Agreeableness is related to getting along, though, and not to getting ahead, while a component of extroversion is related to getting ahead, but not getting along. Emphasizing fit based on personality can also help us increase fairness while adding to the ability to predict performance. Assessment of some individual difference characteristics are biased against different demographic groups, but personality tests don't tend to have that bias. Altogether, thinking about the ideas I've highlighted can help you understand the answers to each of the questions for the module. Perhaps more importantly, I hope they help you think about the practical meaning of those answers and how that adds to what we intuitively know.